What's that?
It feel very quiet as a seminar.
I think I'll get started. Okay, so this is a pretty straightforward applied paper that I've been working on with Sarah and Giovanni over the past year or so. The topic is the gender pay gap, and in particular, who works for whom in the gender pay gap, in particular, the role of firms in the gender pay gap. And as you can see from this rather elaborate disclaimer here, the real innovation of this paper is the data, which legally I have to put this disclaimer in here to say that I'm not representing the views of particular bodies, etc. Okay, so the main motivation for the paper is the fact that we still have a gender pay gap of around 17% in the UK, if you take the mean between all employees, excluding overtime. Not only do we still have that large gender pay gap now in the contemporary moment, it's a very relevant issue, it's in the public attention, and it's also in policymakers' attention as well. So to explain this gender pay gap, as you can imagine, there's a huge literature, even just focusing on the UK case, and most of this more recent literature uses household survey-based longitudinal data sets to unpick the observable characteristics of workers and wage premiums that could explain this pay gap, but also controlling for the influence of unobservable fixed worker characteristics that you couldn't otherwise identify, such as ability or preferences. The issue with these studies is that they also fail to address firm-specific wage premiums. They fail to address anything which could be unobservable at the firm level. So one fairly recent paper from the IFS, which used one of these household survey-based data sets, the BHPS, found, for example, that a substantial amount of this large 17% gender pay gap is accounted for by work experience, and accumulated work experience and working hours over the lifetime. However, you could critique that paper if it didn't control for the influence of firms, since a long literature going back to the human resources and Tolkien Ward shows that.
Sorry,
No,
I think I set
shows
my
that-
phone somewhere. So
shows-
hopefully I'll come back with the phone. Sorry.
So a long literature goes back and finds that actually returns to things like experience and tenure are particularly biased upwards if you don't control for the way in which workers sort over firms, in particular the match or the firm-specific components of the wage. And these firm-specific wage premiums actually explain quite a large fraction of UK overall wage inequality. And by a firm-specific wage premium, I mean a particular wage premium that is paid to all workers at the firm, irrespective of who they are. So the contribution of this paper is that previously there was no UK representative evidence that the gender wage gap is a within firm or is not a within firm issue. Okay? So we ask how much of the UK hourly wage gap is accounted for by the differences between men and women whom they work for. And if you want to slightly nuance that question, we ask more specifically how much is explained by the relative wage premiums that firms paid their employees before or after adjusting for the influence of other factors, such as occupations and tenure. Okay, so as I said, there's a huge related literature on the gender wage gap, but focusing in particular on the most relevant literature for this paper. Going back to the 90s, a lot of papers looked at whether workplace competition. Yeah.
So, Carl, just for clarification, when you're talking about wage premium,
Yeah.
you're talking about the relative level of pay in a firm across all.
Yes,
employees.
compared to another firm, and it's
It's
identified
high wage or low wage firm.
relative to another firm.
Thank you.
It's going to be identified from switching.
Yeah, yeah.
How workers switch across firms. Okay, so the most relevant literature going back to the 90s and early 2000s was a series of papers which looked at cross-sectional data and looked at whether gender wage gaps were associated with particular segregation of workers across firms, across occupations by gender. For the UK in particular, a couple of papers have looked at this using cross-sectional linked employer-employee data and found that particular workplace characteristics can be associated with gender pay gaps and how workers sort themselves over those particular workplace characteristics. The limitation of those two studies were they did not have longitudinal data. So therefore they couldn't also control for the way in which workers themselves sort based on their own observable characteristics like preferences and productivity. So as more and more sources of representative employer-employee longitudinal data sets become available, this has reignited the literature looking into the question of whether a large part of the gender wage gap can be explained by who people work for as opposed to any particular characteristics those workers themselves have. So most infamously, Card and others in QJE used an amazing source of linked Portuguese data to disentangle actually not only is it the firm wage premiums that could account for the gender pay gap, but whether it was a bargaining channel, i.e. differences in the wage premiums paid to men and women within the same firm, or whether it was or it was just a general sorting of men and women across firms of different wage levels. Wage premiums. Cardoso, who was also a co-author on the Card paper, then looked at whether once you adjust for the pay for certain observable characteristics in the wage gap, such as you take away the influence of tenure, and you get something which is perhaps more colloquially known as, say, the adjusted or the unexplained gender pay gap, how much of that can then be accounted for by firm-specific wage premium. This paper by Card now has been widely replicated and extended to other countries. So Bruns, forthcoming in AJ Applied, looks at not only at the German gender wage gap, but also looks at whether sorting differences in sorting across firms could explain trends in the wage gap over time. These other papers by Bruns and Sorkin for the US, unlike the Card paper, who did find a bargaining channel, i.e. men seem to have greater bargaining power within firms. For Germany and the US, and also other papers now from Denmark and France, have not found any particular bargaining channel in the wage gap. So the methods we're going to be drawing on, people might be familiar with the AKM class of models. So the AKM class of models are developed by Avowed and others, and they were initially developed to answer the question of whether high-wage workers work for high-wage firms, under particular assumptions and whether that was consistent with theoretical models. Card and others, in a couple of papers and several other papers, have extended those methods to look at understanding and decomposing overall wage inequality and understanding whether that wage inequality changes over time is explained by between firm or within firm differences. Cardoso, as I've already mentioned, they're going to apply something called the Gehlbach Decomposition, which we're going to mirror quite closely and extend slightly to understand whether firms can account for an adjusted or an unexplained part of the gender wage gap. So the Gehlbach Decomposition, has anybody come across it yet? It's fairly recent, but it's a very nifty econometric paper. So the Gehlbach Decomposition, well, the motivation of the Gehlbach paper was from him looking through a lot of papers in top journals and finding that people seem to not realize that the order in which you put covariates into a regression affects the way you can interpret whether they affect changes in some other variable of interest in that regression model. Say, for instance, you were doing a Mincer earnings regression, you wanted to look at, say, the black-white wage gap. If you attributed the change in a black-white wage gap to putting more variables into the regression equation, the order in which you put those variables into the regression equation can affect your interpretation of what explained the change in your estimated black-white wage gap. So the Gehlbach decomposition, as it was written in this paper, is a way to disentangle the influence of putting more covariates into a linear regression on the change in some other parameter of interest, which is invariant to the order in which you put them into the regression model. It sounds very simple, but it's surprising how many people get that wrong. And I'd have a wager with people that during the external seminar series for the rest of the year, someone will get that wrong. Okay, so we're going to apply this Gehlbach decomposition. Okay, so before I describe the data, I'll go through the method. And since we're not probably all familiar with the AKM type wage models, I'll describe our wage model in full. Okay, so on the left-hand side, we have the wage for worker I in period T. And we regress that on a set of k time-varying covariates in X. It's easier to think about it in perhaps in stacked matrix notation. And then we also have worker fixed effects and firm fixed effects, where this indicator J just indicates that worker I in period T was working for firm J, and then we have a residual. So it looks very simple, it's very easy to estimate, it's a little bit more challenging how you interpret that wage model, and particular assumptions you're making in order to interpret these these firm fixed wage premium that you're estimating. Okay, so some key issues and points regarding the AKM type models. So the first thing is that these estimated firm wage premia are only comparable within mobility groups of workers. That is, workers who are connected to one another through their mobility across firms. Otherwise, these estimated wage premias, if they were from separate mobility groups of workers and firms, they're then uncomparable with one another. Okay, so typically the solution is you only estimate these models on the largest connected set of workers and firms. That is, workers who are linked to one another through the firms that they work for. Okay, another key assumption which tends to be critiqued is the assumed additive separability of the worker and firm fixed effects. You might have seen other models, wage models, where instead they'd assume perhaps a match-specific component of the wage, which captures both the worker and the firm components. Generally, in most work data, that assumption seems to be quite workable, in the sense that when you actually estimate models with a match-specific component rather than a worker and fixed component, the fit of the model doesn't really change very much. So the key assumption of this class of models, which is particularly controversial, is that the OLS estimation of this type of model requires a very strong exogenous mobility assumption. So it requires that the mobility across firms is completely exogenous to things which are contained potentially within the residual. Those things which could be potentially included within the residual, which you might imagine could be very correlated with mobility, are, for example, a match-specific component, which could be time-varying. So workers might be induced to switch between firms just because the current level quality of their match has changed, or vice versa because they're expecting a better match quality in a future firm. It could also be, mobility could also be correlated perhaps with whether there are specific, whether are firm-specific shocks which affect all workers within the firm. So if the firm's doing badly, it's laying off workers, and you might be induced to move for that reason.
But then again, what about, so you're excluding the possibility here, are you, of endogenous mobility due to wage premium differences in wage?
No.
Yeah.
So because we can, no, so any matching or selection based on fixed worker characteristics, fixed which affect wage premium, and the firm characteristics are fine, because they're controlled for in the model.
Right.
Also, for example, if workers were moving selectively across firms because they wanted a full-time job rather than a part-time job, because they're going to be contained within X. So the mobility only has to be exogenous to, well, there are three. It's the match-specific shocks, it's the firm-specific shock that affects all workers within the same firm, and it's also the idea of a direction as well, that you only move for wage growth, perhaps, within a new firm. So actually, surprisingly, in the data, these assumptions don't look too bad. And the way that people test this is they run event studies in their data. So I'll just show you what one of those event studies looks like. Okay, so the way that we test these assumptions is we take all the workers who are moving either side of zero. So in here, these workers have had a move, and we lump them into quartiles of their co-worker wages. Okay, so here I'm showing the mean log wages on average in our data set of people who have moved from a firm where their co-worker wage is in the bottom quartile of wages, and they're moving to firms where potentially their co-workers have higher wages in the distribution. So first one, there's no evidence here between -2 and -1, which are the periods before you make the switch, of any sort of dip in wages, which is known as an Ashenfelter dip, Ashenfelter card dip. That one reason that you might be induced to move is because you had a wage drop before the move. That would violate our exogenous mobility assumption if that was prevalent in the data. Also, there's no particular difference when we do this across more particular quartiles and more particular deciles as well. There's no evidence that there are any particular differences in trends either side of the move. And also, I didn't actually include it here because I haven't got people switching in the other direction, but you also have symmetry in the moves. People moving from, say, quartile 4 to quartile 1 have very similar wage drops as the rise from people moving from 1 to 4, because these estimated wage premium are symmetric. So basically, there is evidence when workers move from a firm where their co-workers are relatively low paid to a firm where their co-workers are relatively high paid, or vice versa, that they have wage changes because following that. Okay, so another, so I mentioned earlier that these wage models have been used to decompose wage inequality, and in particular they're used very widely to decompose the overall variance of wages. Now that's problematic, and that variance decomposition, the components of that are very biased. This isn't particularly relevant to our paper, but I thought it was useful and interesting to know if anyone is thinking of applying these models. So in particular, if any of these fixed effects are estimated with errors, then obviously the variance of those components in any decomposition are going to be biased upwards, because those sampling errors bias up the variance. Similarly, as I was explaining before, these models have been used to understand whether the covariance of wages or the correlation of wages accounts for wage inequality. The problem being that actually these same estimation errors bias downwards the covariance in worker and firm fixed effects. So these models aren't particularly useful in small sample settings for understanding things like, are high wage workers working for high wage firms more generally in the overall wage distribution, or for decomposing the overall variance of wages. This is known as the limited mobility bias, and it's because this particular bias is related to how many moves there are in the data set. So when you have a small sample, you're limiting the number of moves that you're identifying fixed effects from, which is causing greater estimation errors, which substantially biases any kind of measures of the variance computed from the estimates. However, these are all small sample issues with regards to the variance. In our decompositions, we're just going to be decomposing the mean. And because we're only decomposing the mean, and then we're going to be computing statistics based on the full sample of estimated firm fixed effects, then we should be able to rely on large sample properties. Okay. So, what kind of decomposition do we do? So the first one is we just decompose the raw pay gap, and that's a standard Oaxaca-style decomposition. We just take the estimated fixed effects from the regression model, average them for the men, average them for the women, and subtract them from one another. Okay, and that gives us the component of the difference in raw wages, which is accounted for by which firm-specific wage premium men and women are earning in the labour market. Now the Gehlbach decomposition is a bit more complicated. And for the intuition, it helps if we rewrite the full model slightly. Okay, so here we take the AKM model from before, and we just break up that firm worker fixed effect into several components. First would be something which would normally be absorbed by that fixed effect, which would be a gender wage premium, 1G, estimated given by lambda tilde. Then we can also have other time invariant characteristics related to the worker, which would also normally be absorbed by the worker fixed effect, and they're contained in W. So they could be things like birth cohort of the worker. And similarly, we can do that for the firm fixed effect as well. We can take out time invariant characteristics, okay, such as the industry sector of the firm, or whether it's private or public sector. Again, the reason we do that is because if you want to start thinking about decomposing an adjusted measure of the wage gap, rather than the raw wage gap, you would think that these factors like industry sector, private sector, birth cohort could also be relevant. In most studies which aren't using longitudinal data, you'll find those factors being used to account for part of the observed wage gap. Okay, so the Gehlbach decomposition is a way of moving between this full model that we've estimated using this full AKM model that we've estimated, and looking at this the difference between that model and also what would be our basic wages model. So here we just have the observable characteristics of workers and firms in X, and we would get some adjusted or unexplained gender wage gap given by lambda. Okay, so what we're trying to understand, why it's kind of like an admitted variable bias kind of decomposition, is we're trying to understand how much of this adjusted wage gap is accounted for by when we estimate a full wages model and then include these residual worker and firm fixed wage premiums. So we're then going to be able to disentangle how much of that adjusted wage gap is accounted for by conditional on X tilde, conditional on the amount which is explained by X tilde, how much is then accounted for by where men and women work, or whether they work for high or low wage firms. Has everybody got that? It's quite... So we're decomposing a raw wage gap using the full wage model, and then we're also decomposing an adjusted wage gap. Okay, and the way we actually do that is we multiply both sides of the full wages model by this messy object, gamma. Now gamma should look very familiar to you as the formula for admitted variable bias. Okay, and if you replaced these X tildes by just ones, vectors of ones, all gamma would do when you multiplied it by a variable was it would demean it and find the gender gap, multiplied by this G prime, which is the gender. Okay, so what we're doing by multiplying any object by this gamma is we're demeaning it and finding the gender gap, conditional on whatever's contained in X. Okay, so we do that, we multiply both sides of the full wages model, the AKM model that has the worker and firm fixed effects in it by this gamma. That gives us on the left-hand side then an adjusted gender pay gap, as you would get from just estimating this basic wages model. And then on the right-hand side, disentangles anything which is included in your full wages model, which is not included in the basic wages model, you can then disentangle as contributing to this adjusted wage gap. And in particular, in our baseline, our preferred spec, we just want to disentangle whether this adjusted unexplained gender pay gap is accounted for either by the distribution of worker fixed effects, or what we're going to term very loosely a gender firm sorting effect, which is what wage premiums men and women are receiving. Okay, so then the difference between this component of the gender wage gap and the adjusted one, and the raw Oaxaca style one, is simply that we're conditioning on X. We're conditioning on these whatever's in X tilde, observable characteristics, before we decompose the gender wage gap. Okay, okay, so our data, which is, oh sorry, I should have mentioned, the only difference between us and other people that have estimated this, so Cardoso and others in Oxford Economic Papers, they realized the usefulness of this method for decomposing the gender wage gap. The difference between us and them is that we include in X tilde, we realize that you can also condition on fixed time invariant characteristics of the workers and firms. So they only realized that you could decompose this version of the full wages model relative to the basic wages model, whereas we also kind of realize that you can throw in fixed characteristics as well, such as your private sector, industry sector, and you can take those out of the wage gap and adjust for those first, before you then attribute gender firm sorting to that adjusted wage gap. So you can take out the firm fixed bits, observable fixed characteristics. Okay, so the data, which is really the most important part of the paper. So we're using something which I've used widely on my other work, which is the annual survey of hours and earnings, which is a 1% representative of a random sample of all employees in the economy. It's a panel without attrition and with replacement. And the way that works is if your national insurance number ends in 14, you're in the data set, if you're in work, and it looks you up. Okay? It even effectively, I guess, looks you up if you're already dead. Okay? Because it's just looking for people who have a national insurance number ending in 14 at any point in time. So it's always representative. And it's all completely random sampling. Okay, so the data come from an employer survey after you've been looked up. So they look you up on the national insurance HMRC register, they find your PAYE number, your employer, and they send out a survey. And actually for very large firms, it's self-reported by the firms using an automatic computer system. So it comes direct from the payroll.
And how is it included overtime?
So we have detailed components of hours worked. So our hourly wage rate is excluding overtime in our main specification.
It's just an average.
It's just an average of your pay in a reference week in April. And so actually the measure that they record is the gross weekly wage and the basic hours worked, and then all of the components of pay as well. So things like overtime, incentive pay, shift pay. They record annual wages, including all your bonus payments over the last year.
But in your work, you're just going to lump total pay as it were from whatever.
Well, we're taking out overtime.
Are you taking out of it?
No, we take out overtime. We leave in there any premiums that you might have for doing shift work or bank holidays, and any potential incentive-related pay that you might have received in that period. It's supposed to be your usual pay, though.
Yeah.
We can vary that. We do look at weekly earnings as well. So we take out the hours component. Okay, so also very useful in this data is it's very detailed records of the occupation from the employer's perspective, not the employees, and has the hours worked, which you don't find, those two things you don't necessarily always find in these administrative type data sets. So in each annual cross-section for a firm, you're getting on average 1% of the firm's employees. Okay, and the firm in this data set is an administrative definition called an enterprise, and using the ONS definition, that's typically, they think of that as the lowest sort of autonomous decision-making level of the firm. I think that's how they kind of talk about it. So it would be something like Tesco, rather than a branch of Tesco. So it's not plants or establishments, it's actually firms. And there is evidence that actually, for the vast majority of employees, pay-setting decisions actually do take place at this firm enterprise level in the UK, rather than at the plant or establishment level. Okay, so what does the sample look like? So here, we compare what we call our analysis sample. So the analysis sample is the largest connected set of workers and firms that we can actually estimate this thing from, this wages model from, whereas on the right-hand panel is the whole ASH, the whole representative data set. So actually that analysis sample is 87% of the observations we have in this period. So 87% of the workers are connected to one another through their firms that they work for. So sample size of men, we have 825,000 person years, representing 132,000 women, men and 124,000 women, and we've got 87,000 firms represented. So the key differences the differences between the whole ASH and our selected sample are because we're taking away that 13%, and that 13% being not unconnected will tend to be very, very small, tiny firms. Okay, so you can see that in the difference in the mean firm size between the whole ASH and our analysis sample, and also an interesting statistic on the share of female workers at the firm, which gives you an idea of the raw sort of amount of gender segregation in this in the UK. So this tells us that if you're a man, the share of women at your firm is 31% amongst your co-workers, whereas if you're a woman, it's more like 71%. Actually, our sample is slightly less gender segregated than the whole economy. If you're in smaller firms are likely to be even more gender segregated than large firms.
Public sector in there as well?
Yes. Yeah, the share in the private sector for men is 71%. It's 48%. It's a very it's a very broad definition of the public sector. Includes non-profits and things like that as well. That's my return button. Okay, so as I said earlier, the wage premia, the firm wage premia, are identified from switching. Okay, so the amount of mobility in the data set is what identifies our model. Okay, so this gives us the distribution of the number of different jobs held by workers in the analysis sample. So around 48% of the workers never switch in our period. Okay, but more than half actually do have more than one job in this period. And around over a quarter have more than two jobs. And that's very similar for men and women. Okay. Okay, so what does the gender wage gap look like? So here in the solid series we plot time series of the log hourly wage gap from the whole ASH and also from the analysis sample. So the wage gap is slightly higher but follows a very similar trend. Identical trend as in the whole representative ASH, which is also what the UK uses for its national statistics on the wage gap. Interestingly, if you compare wage series and wage gaps from this administrative data set with the household data sets which are used more widely, you tend to find actually quite different trends in the wage gap using the longitudinal household survey data sets. And that's the HBS Understanding Society is given by this sort of light dashed line.
Well, this is always like in monetary terms, this log of hourly wage. What is the measure in monetary terms, like in pounds or?
The measure is in the.
You have a lot.
Is it in the sample descriptives? It's there. Okay. So I'd have to E that.
So how big is this gap in monetary terms?
Yeah, it's about two.
Pounds per hour.
13 to 10 something.
Yeah.
13 and something maybe, and then all the other.
Per hour.
Around that.
Thanks.
We're in £2,002. So okay. What does the distribution of wages look like in the sample? So you've got male and female. Male with the solid series. As you can see, women more congregated towards particularly low wages, in particular much more clustered towards the national minimum wage. If we compare that, well, that's the male comparison, that's our whole ASH sample versus our analysis sample. There's practically no difference in the wage distribution. Likewise for women. So our sample, in our view, is very representative. Okay, so now moving on to some results. So this gives the a summary of the estimation of the AKM wages model. Okay, so the standard deviation of wages in the sample is around a half of log wages, is around a half for men and women. The interesting summary statistic here is the correlation between the estimated worker and the firm fixed effects, firm wage premiums. In our data, we find a slightly negative, but basically zero correlation between worker wage premiums by high wage workers and high wage firms, which is kind of implausible, and that is showing us probably the evidence of what is the limited mobility bias that you find when you're trying to decompose these kinds of, trying to use these models to estimate these kind of statistics. Our R squared is 0.9, and we find when we replace the worker and the firm fixed effects with a match-specific fixed effect, that only goes up by around a percentage point. So just, even though it's kind of tangential to our particular question, just thought for interest to present the variance decomposition, so perhaps ignoring the male and female, focusing on the total. So these are the shares of the variance in wages in the overall economy accounted for by worker fixed wage effects. the firm effects, so these firm-specific wage premiums do account for around 12% in our data, in our decomposition. That estimate is biased upwards by any estimation error. And the covariance is approximately 0, which is biased downwards mechanically by these estimation errors. And then the other characteristics which we're including in the model, which are polynomials in employer age, year fixed effects, tenure, whether workers working full-time or part-time, and firm size. So time-varying characteristics of firms and workers, they account for about a fifth of the wage variance in the model, in the sample. Okay, so what actually do we find when we do the Oaxaca-style decomposition of this mean raw log gender pay gap? So the raw pay gap is 0.2. The raw log pay gap is 0.2. We find that the way in which men and women are allocated to these fixed wage effects, firm fixed wage effects, accounts for 3.6 log points, or around 16% of the pay gap at the average. Interestingly, the occupations contribute far less than that. Only 6% of the wage gap is accounted for by the way in which men and women are differently allocated to occupations. And then the other characteristics average out to around 0 and not undoing a lot. The vast majority is explained by worker fixed effects. And these are characteristics which you would expect men and women to take with them wherever they go in the labour market. Things like their preferences, their human capital that they've accumulated up to this stage, their innate productivity, are all explaining any kind of average discrimination perhaps in the economy between men and women. They're explaining the vast majority of the raw wage gap. Okay, so here we plot the distributions over employees of the estimated worker-specific fixed real hourly wage effects. So men have this these higher density of high transferable wages that they take wherever they work than women do, who are clustered much more towards low wage effects, low fixed wage worker wage effects. So then we can also plot the distributions over men and women of the firm wage effects. These are averaged out to 0 over both men and women overall. So you can see there is some tendency here of very high wage firms for men to be overrepresented. At the very bottom, men and women are equally well represented in very low wage firms. And it's sort of low middle wages where women are overrepresented. In terms of the firm wages, firm average wages. So we can also look within subsamples of the data after we've estimated the model. So here we plot the difference in the distribution of firm wage effects received by workers, conditional on them working in the private sector. Okay, so we can see that in the private sector, this is where the vast majority of any differences between men and women are coming from. Okay, you see these large density of women are receiving relatively low firm wages or working for relatively low wage firms. Whereas in the public sector, there isn't a lot of difference in where men in representation in terms of high or low wage effects between men and women. We can also look at particular sectors of the economy. This is one that people find surprising, usually. So within financial services, there is no difference in representation between men and women in terms of working for high or low wage firms. That's not to say that men don't have a huge wage premium in the financial sector, but conditional on working in the finance sector, men and women are equally distributed amongst the high wage financial services firms relative to the low wage ones. So i.e. Metro Bank versus Goldman Sachs. Okay, there's no sort of gender sorting effect of more men towards Goldman Sachs versus Metro Bank. I didn't include it, I don't think, but where the big difference is, which explains all that private sector difference in the distribution, is in services, in retail services, hospitality sector. Okay, so conditional on working part-time, there isn't that much difference in the distribution of men and women over high and low wage firms. Whereas there is greater differences once you condition on them working full-time. Men are more likely, when still working full-time, to be in higher wage firms. Age. So if we look at particular age groups, so first looking at age 25 to 34, fairly small differences in the allocation of workers over high and low wage firms when they start out in the labour market. Although we can't really say start out in the labour market because we've got a very short panel, 2002, so we're mixing in birth cohort effects and age here. Well, then when we kind of get a bit older and look at men and women aged 35 to 45, you see much larger differences in representation opening up. So once you approach middle age, as a woman, you're much more likely to work for a low wage firm than a man. And then it extends out. Generally, the differences get larger as you get older as well, but mostly open up around age 30. Okay, so now moving on to our Gehlbach decomposition results. So these are the decomposition now, an adjusted measure of the log gender wage gap. Okay, so starting with our preferred results, which is in column 3. So here we condition on, in the basic wage model, we condition on age, tenure, firm, size, part-time, but also on industry sector, public-private sector status, birth cohort. That gives us, after conditioning on those, an adjusted pay gap of around 14.5 log points. And when we decompose that into the amount which is accounted for by gender firm sorting, we find less than 1 log point, or around 6%, is accounted for by the differences in the firms you work for. Whereas the vast majority is accounted for by these transferable worker fixed effects. If we look at a more basic wage model, where we take out those time invariant characteristics, the public-private sector status, the industry sector, and the birth cohort, then we find from an adjusted wage gap of 0.15, around 7.5%, or 1 log point, is accounted for by the gender firm sorting. And then if we do the most comparable version of our model to previous papers, which have used the Gehlbach decomposition to look at the adjusted wage gap, we find only an adjusted wage gap of 0.2, so we only adjust it slightly from the raw wage gap that we're decomposing. And then within there, we get something obviously very similar to what we found for the raw wage gap, because we barely even adjusted for anything. And then we find 16% again. If we also disentangle, so we take out of the basic wages model the occupations, and then we decompose an adjusted wage gap, which doesn't include the influence of occupations, so we're trying to see whether it's occupations or firms within an unexplained portion of the pay gap. We find that actually occupations and firms don't explain very much of the adjusted wage gap, both around 1 log point. So actually, just kind of the upshot is what accounts for the gender wage gap isn't sorting of workers across occupations or firms, it's what's going on within firms. It's something going on within firms which is manifested in this transferable component of wages that you can take wherever you like. Unsurprising, but it kind of
And by that, you're including things like qualification,
yeah.
skills, skills,
Yeah.
all that.
Yeah.
And that's not in there.
No, that would be in
It
alpha.
would be in there.
Yeah.
You take a step up in
No. So in effect, because we started out by saying that this gender firm sorting could perhaps be confounding papers which didn't control for this in the first place, confounding the results from those papers, actually our results are pretty much supportive of a lot of previous work which wasn't able to account for this gender firm sorting effect on wages, on the wage gap. And the traditional explanations of preferences, human capital, aren't contradicted by these results. Okay, so we look at sub-periods in the paper as well, and we find that these results are consistent across the period, or consistent with sub-periods. So we also look at weekly earnings versus the hourly wages, because there's an idea in the literature that women sought towards, men sought perhaps more towards high hours firms, which could therefore mean that you'd find a bigger gender firm sorting effect if you looked at weekly earnings versus hourly wages, if men were sorting in that way. So when we look at, compare our baseline estimates here for hourly wages and the exact same sample of workers and firms look at decomposing gross weekly earnings, the observed gap now is sort of 50 log points. The adjusted gap goes down to 17 log points, and actually the share accounted for by gender firm sorting doesn't change very much. So at the mean, on average, there isn't any sort of evidence that a large fraction of the gender weekly earnings gap is accounted for by men and women sorting differently towards high hours firms as well as high wage firms. Okay, so in conclusion, so what we conclude from these results is that the clear majority of what explains the wage gap is showing up within firms, not between them. And in some sense, therefore, this kind of justifies recent pay reporting legislation that's been brought in the UK, where all firms, public and private sector, now have to report their pay gaps, because before that legislation was brought in, there was actually no evidence to support the idea that it wasn't a between firm issue, rather than a within firm issue. The actual data recorded by those firms wouldn't be enough to tell you whether it was a between firm or a within firm issue, because it's just too partial. It doesn't tell it, you wouldn't allow it to be able to control for these fixed worker characteristics that transfer across firms. And I think this kind of more inspires areas for future research that we're looking into. So things like unpicking what goes on within particular firms and job roles is still very relevant, and that's something which Card and others, as I mentioned before, have already looked at, whether what explains these particular differences in firm wage premium, what there is, and what that does explain of the wage gap could be something to do with bargaining at the firm level. Other people have looked at whether there's something going on, difference between men and women in wage growth on the job. And then also, we plan to look at whether there's anything going on with regards to workplace management practices. And then also an area which is kind of disregarded, because we saw the minimum wage seem to bunch up the distributions of wages. When we've got an environment where the living wage is being increased, whether there's any role for, or what kind of effects the national living wage and the living wage have on these sorting patterns over firms and occupations, and also on just the average pay gap. So I have one further result that I was only going to include if time permitted. So this is a different representation of what's going on with the wage gap throughout the wage distribution. So here, the way we construct this graph is I find all the men and women, so I take the whole employee population and put them into percentiles. So within a percentile, the men and women have roughly equal pay. Okay? Then I look up their worker fixed effect and their firm fixed effect and subtract them from one another. So in effect, this says that if you're working at the 20th percentile of wages, and you're comparing yourself to a man, and you're a woman, on average, to get to the 20th percentile of wages, as a woman, you have to work for a slightly higher wage firm. Whereas at the 20th percentile of wages, the man is earning more, is earning the same as you, but he's got this higher transferable wage component. So in a way, the other factors must be accounting for why you're at the same wage. So in fact, you're likely to perhaps be in a higher paid occupation or have higher tenure experience than the man who is at this part of the wage distribution. And you see at the very top of the wage distribution, these kind of unexplained, unobservable effects become really important in accounting for, even though this men and women at this part of the wage distribution have the same pay, the man has this transferable fixed worker component which accounts for his pay that the woman doesn't have. Whereas her high pay is more likely to be accounted for by occupation, tenure, etc., and experience. Okay. Any more questions?
So there might be maybe an obvious question, but one thing you haven't really discussed here is the role of parenthood
Yeah.
and maternity. And there's a lot of discussion. There was a recent conference on the gender pay gap, which talks about how women's wages diverge basically around the age of 30 when they enter motherhood.
Yeah, so that's the Costa Diaz paper from the IFS looks at that as well.
Yes,
And
exactly.
several papers. So yeah, unfortunately in these data
So
we don't have any of that information.
But so for example, it's the income is in 1 week in April.
1 week
So
in April.
do you have any indication of whether someone is on maternity in that week? Because that would
We
presumably
exclude-
affect measurement.
We
of-
exclude them.
Okay, so
we
you do
exclude-
know if,
So we exclude anyone whose pay is lower than usual for any reason.
so you might observe a woman who, is because this is a panel of workers?
Yeah.
So you would observe someone before they went on maternity leave and afterwards?
We wouldn't know the reason they were on leave.
Okay.
And it doesn't actually specifically tell us it's maternity leave. So
But
I'm not
you-
even
I
sure we're
mean,
allowed to say.
You would know what, if they're on maternity leave.
So we know the age and we can see the differences by age over that.
But you also know what maternity pay is, and you can kind of infer, at
Yeah.
least descriptively,
I mean,
because you know what maternity pay is fixed, and once you reach like 4 months or whatever.
well, they wouldn't be in the data set if they're on maternity pay.
Okay, so they
Because
they don't
they
appear in
would-
the data set.
They'd be
Okay.
removed. More generally, I think the alphas are capturing sort of preferences towards these things
Okay.
over lifetime. And the only way you can really identify those effects is through shocks to fertility anyway. And so we're not going to see that.
But maternity might be one reason for someone changing jobs, for example. So have you thought about how that?
Sure, if they're changing because it's a part-time,
Well,
Or
not
they
necessarily
wanted less
part-time,
hours.
Might be more flexible working hours. So maybe that.
but if that, as long as that's unrelated, and uncorrelated with the wage. So if that characteristic of the job was uncorrelated with wages, that would be fine. If they're moving for location or so there's better working hours or something, that's fine.
Okay, I mean, you could argue that people move to more flexible jobs which are of lower wage because that fits in more with their life. So it's not necessarily about it being closer, but
Yeah,
some
but
jobs are more flexible.
I
So
agree.
you take a pay cut in order to fit in with your life circumstances.
So I agree, and that's part of the firm
Okay.
component. And perhaps there is something else residual on top of that.
Mhm.
But if it was time, only if it was time varying
Okay.
at the firm level and affecting all workers, would it matter?
So it might be interesting to, I mean, even though they're not sort of a part of the big picture in terms of explaining variation, but look into the firm fixed effects, right? So you could, in principle, estimate a firm fixed effect for men and firm fixed effect for women, and then look at the firms where the fixed effects are sort of a low pay gap versus a wide pay gap, and try and explain that.
So, so that's exactly what Card and others do.
Oh, okay.
So that's where they disentangle bargaining and sorting effects, and they normalise them using productivity data and other methods to make them comparable. Because if you just estimated them separately, they're completely incomparable.
Okay.
So they do that. The reason we don't do that, even though some papers which have replicated it have, is that you have to then estimate a male and a female model. To make comparison, they have to be dual connected, so they have to be in the same sets of firms. And as you do that, you diminish your connected set of workers and firms, particularly when we're only starting with a 1% sample. So I have estimated it, and I have done that kind of stuff, but the sample gets, it becomes far less representative, is why I would not do it with 1% data. But yeah, this Card paper in QJD is very good. They do look at that.
Can I ask a really
Yeah.
sort of outrageous question? First of all, I think it's a great piece of work, and I've learned quite a bit from it. Where does your work take you, if anywhere, towards the question of whether women are discriminated against?
Nowhere.
Exactly.
I don't think so. Giovanni?
That's really difficult to do anyway. The only way they've done it is through experiments.
So we do.
I mean, you have to, so if where you're coming from is whether this doesn't aim to assess whether, you know, there's discrimination or not. But, I mean, I'm sure you said it was late, but it's about trying to explain more about the role of firms.
Yeah.
Because traditionally, you know, the gender pay gap has been explained by other firms, you know, characteristics that
Or
people have, individuals have, and so this is actually trying to explain more about the role of firms.
And individual.
And the interaction between what people bring to the firm and what firms have within them, yeah. So that's what it's.
So there is another source of data that we can link to this, which is the Workplace Employment Relations Survey, which gives us all the sort of soft information about contracting, flexible working. So we can look a little bit more in detail about what characteristics firms correlated with high wage premiums at the firms. But I don't think we can get any kind of... We can get the attitudes towards workers within the firms where they feel discriminated against. We actually can get that kind of information and link that to these firms. But,
What about this legislation here that asks firms, is it for all,
for all firms now.
compulsory for all firms?
Just
They have to
report.
pay 250.
oh yeah,
Yeah,
250
so
hours.
can't you look at the impact of this policy?
You can over time perhaps
Yeah,
get an impact.
You won't have the data
It's
yet.
just from April.
But
Yeah.
at the end, right, to have used the discontinuity around 200 employees and look at whether this actually decreased that within firm effect.
Yeah,
In which year was introduced?
April
This year.
2018.
but you
Ah.
would not...
Raising has got a 22% gender pay gap, University of Reading. We discovered after
From the
From this-
Yeah.
the report.
But that would be...
I mean, that, you know,
But
not
you
in the
massively-
short term, I've
You'd be
changed.
loading the answer in your favour massively, because if firms are responding to the pay gap, they're likely to respond in terms of workforce as well, in terms of who they hire, rather, and how that correlates to gender, to get their pay gap down.
Whatever they do is
But that's-
super
that-
interesting to find
Yeah,
out.
that's fine,
Yeah.
but you wouldn't be able to identify anything
But also,
different
yeah.
from their, with regard to pay versus composition.
Yeah.
They'd get their pay gaps down, but was that to the benefit of workers?
Yeah,
You wouldn't be able to tell.
maybe it's the time to collect data, figure out one of these answers.
But often these policies therefore
Yeah.
behave in the way they expect,
Yeah.
because when they ask executive compensation,
Yeah.
and then the pay just keeps going up, so they don't always have the desired effect.
Yes.
Or gender on boards, where
Yeah.
in Norway
Yeah,
it's just
that
all the same
always is,
people on
anyway,
the same boards,
interesting
Yeah.
answer, the one
on
thing
different boards.
about policy impact, so.
Thanks.